Welcome to the debate. Today we are diving into a really complex area of U.S. policy regarding military recognition. We're looking at the status of allied personnel who supported U.S. forces in conflict, focusing specifically on the Hmong and Laos Special Guerrilla Unit, the SGU, veterans of the secret war in Laos.
That's right. And this policy issue, it really hits at fundamental questions of honor, respect, and how we reconcile a national moral debt with the intricacies of federal law. We're talking about individuals whose service was absolutely critical to U.S. operations, but who, were never formally in the U.S. Armed Forces.
And that distinction between service to U.S. interests and service in U.S. forces, that really is the essential legal pivot point here. So the central question we need to grapple with is the policy rationale behind the current system, this sort of fragmented recognition. Why does the federal structure grant SGU veterans eligibility for internment in, sacred ground, specifically national cemeteries, while at the same time denying them military funeral honors, MFH, things like the flag folding, the playing of taps?
And from my perspective, this current policy is, it's fundamentally flawed. I'd argue that this structure creates a kind of unsustainable and frankly conceptually contradictory form of recognition. When the government grants the most permanent benefit, a burial site, yet denies the most visible, final symbols of honor, it just renders the recognition itself incomplete. We really need harmonization here.
That's a powerful position, certainly rooted in moral obligation. But I come at it from a slightly different angle. My position is that this approach, while it might appear contradictory on the surface, is actually necessary. It accurately maintains the strict legal distinction between service under Title X, which governs the U.S. Armed Forces and the Department of Defense, the DoD, and recognition granted under Title 38, which governs the Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA, and handles long-term benefits. This legal precision, I believe, is vital for the integrity of our military entitlement system.
But doesn't that focus on legal neatness? Doesn't it result in a pretty profound symbolic slight to these individuals and their families?
Well, let's examine the framework for a moment. When Congress passed the Hmong Veterans Service Recognition Act back in 2018, it was a very precise legislative action. It amended a specific section of Title 38, that's 38 U.S.C. Section 2402A10, to extend eligibility just for internment in VA national cemeteries. This was a specific, targeted recognition of Allied support managed by the VA. And crucially, Congress consciously stopped short of granting full veteran status or, importantly, amending Title X, which governs the DoD's military funeral honors.
Right, but that targeted approach, while maybe legally precise, is exactly where the contradiction begins for me. These service was deemed critical enough to warrant permanent national recognition under Title 38, giving them a place of honor alongside U.S. veterans. Yet the VA's own National Cemetery Administration guidance makes it crystal clear. SGU veterans are ineligible for the burial flag, the presidential certificate, and most significantly, the federally funded DoD funeral honors. These two benefits, burial and honors, they're inseparable in the minds of the military community and especially the families. Denying the symbolic right governed by Title X when the actual ground is granted under Title 38, it just represents a failure to holistically integrate those individuals whose service has already been legislatively acknowledged.
That's an interesting framing, though I would perhaps put it differently. The denial of military funeral honors isn't intended as a symbolic slight. It's really an operational constraint. It's designed to protect the resources and the legal standards of the active military forces. You look at DoD Instruction 1300.15, it's quite clear. MFH uses active or reserve military personnel and federally funded resources. We have to maintain strict verification that the individual meets the Title X definition of service before we dedicate those active duty resources. This standard is laid out clearly in the Army's own casualty and mortuary affairs regulations, like DAPAM 638-2.
Okay, I understand the administrative justification, the operational argument, but can operational purity really supersede the honor that Congress clearly intended? If the service was sufficient to warrant permanent, sacred ground, then the administrative complexity of verifying and funding, a two-person detail and a flag ceremony, that should be resolved at the federal level, not used as, frankly, an excuse for incomplete recognition.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because what you're asking is for the DoD to bend fundamental legal definitions tied to command structure, to accountability, even the Uniform Code of Military Justice. SGU members were never subject to the UCMJ. Their service, while absolutely heroic, was under a separate allied command structure. Maintaining that Title X boundary, it preserves the meaning of what it is to be a U.S. service member who bore the unique legal obligations of that service.
But hang on, if protecting the purity of Title X is the absolute paramount goal, didn't Congress fundamentally compromise that very integrity back in 2018 when it allowed this specific population into VA cemeteries under Title 38? I mean, that was already a breach, wasn't it, of the traditional definition of veteran status for burial purposes? So if we can compromise for the most solemn entitlement, the land itself, why is the symbolic honor of the flag and tap suddenly the unforgivable line in the sand?
That's a fair challenge. I think the distinction lies in jurisdiction. Title 38, that's the VA's domain, relates to benefits and land use. The VA can extend access to the national cemetery system because that system is designed to honor those who serve the nation, and that can include allied forces recognized by specific congressional acts, like this one. Title 10, though, that's the DoD's domain. It's operational. It relates to the active deployment of military personnel and resources. That difference in operational management, I think that's why the line holds firm. The VA can provide the plot. The DoD cannot, under current law, provide the honor detail without compromising its own Title X structure.
But this reliance on separate legal titles, separate agencies for benefits, it creates enormous policy confusion. And, let's be honest, profound inequality among families. Imagine a family who has successfully navigated the incredibly complex process to verify their father's SGU service, a process, by the way, that often requires finding documentation that's decades old, sometimes classified. They finally achieve what feels like the ultimate recognition, burial in a national cemetery. Yet, when the ceremony actually occurs, they are told, well, yes, you get the headstone in the ground, but sorry, we cannot fold the flag or play taps. How is that not confusing and deeply hurtful?
That precise situation is exactly where targeted state-level legislation proves its value, I think. We are seeing states, particularly Minnesota, which obviously has a large Hmong population, recognize this gap and step in. Look at Minnesota Session Law's 2025 Chapter 30. It actually redefines veteran for state purposes and mandates state-funded funeral honors for SGU veterans buried there.
Okay, but seeing that state-level response as a success? I see it as an indictment of the federal failure. The SGU service wasn't state service, it was national service directed and funded by the CIA and the U.S. military during the Cold War. Relying on patchy state efforts, which, yes, might be robust in Minnesota but maybe non-existent in other states where SGU veterans live, it just ensures that the honor bestowed is unequal and, well, geographically determined. The national honor implied by the service itself shouldn't be relegated to a local VSO stipend, like the $50 Minnesota Statute 197.231 allows, or a specific state fund. It feels like passing the buck.
I wouldn't call it passing the buck. I'd say the local funding mechanisms, like the expanded VSO reimbursement or the dedicated state honors we see developing in Minnesota, are the appropriate way to address the symbolic deficit without eroding the core definitions of Title X service. The system acknowledges the immense debt owed. That led to the crucial grant of internment rights under the VA. Then, states, acting on their deep local connections and understanding, can provide that final symbolic honor. This layered system provides recognition without, fundamentally compromising the structure relied upon by millions of federally recognized Title X veterans.
But this tiered system, this layering, it undermines the moral gravity of the sacrifice that was made. The complexity of verification alone is substantial. You mentioned needing the 2000 Naturalization Act for just basic recognition, and now Minnesota needs a state task force just to prove service even took place for these state benefits. But setting that aside, the message remains fragmented.
If verification is deemed sufficient by Congress itself to place these veterans on hallowed ground alongside U.S. soldiers, then the federal system has a moral, if perhaps not a strictly legal obligation, to harmonize the benefits. It needs to prevent this symbolic slight.
Well, harmonization, as you call it, in this specific case would mean one of two things, right? Either extending Title X eligibility itself to a category of allied combatants, which would be a massive and legally complex undertaking, requiring Congress to define which allied groups qualify and which don't across all conflicts. Or it requires the VA under Title 38 to somehow find and execute ceremonies typically reserved for the DoD under Title X. Neither of those options is administratively simple or, I'd argue, legally sound without some kind of wholesale structural change to Titles 10 and 38. The targeted congressional action for internment, that was manageable. Opening up the entire federal funeral honor system is an entirely different beast.
I absolutely understand the administrative burden, believe me. But the policy effect is what concerns me most. The clear goal, or at least the implied goal of the 2018 Act, was comprehensive recognition for their incredible service. When you separate the right to rest in the national cemetery from the right to the final ceremonial flag, you create, frankly, a public relations disaster and immense hardship for grieving families. It forces them to navigate two separate government agencies, asking why one agency recognizes the service as worthy of the highest honor, burial, and the other denies the most fundamental symbol of that service. This isn't structural integrity, it feels like structural inconsistency.
The consistency, though, lies in the fact that the two benefits originate from two different core missions: long-term welfare and recognition, which is the VA's role, versus active military structure and operations, which is the DoD's role. They are separate legal entitlements governed by separate titles of U.S. code. We can't just collapse these definitions simply because the public, understandably, perceives them as a single holistic package. Policy often needs to be precise, especially when dealing with entitlements and resource allocation. The state solutions I maintain are the necessary legislative fixes to provide that holistic package the families deserve without sacrificing the federal Title X integrity.
But that assumes that the legal boundary drawn decades ago is the only valid way to structure the policy going forward. The core disagreement here, I think, is whether the policy should prioritize maintaining that strict legal boundary almost at all costs, or whether it should recognize the unique, legislatively acknowledged status of these specific allied combatants by creating a specific carve-out that grants both the burial and the symbolic honors together. I argue that the political will that commendably granted the land should have completed the act of honor by also granting the flag at the federal level.
And I continue to maintain that the political will to grant that land, while admirable and arguably overdue, must respect the existing operational frameworks of the DoD under Title X. That distinction is crucial, not just legally, but for the millions of U.S. military veterans whose status is defined by that title.
So, to quickly summarize my position, the current fragmented policy creates a persistent, painful contradiction where recognition is legally granted for internment but symbolically and functionally withheld for honors. The implementation of this divided policy leaves SGU families with incomplete and administratively confusing honors, undermining the very respect intended. We need a unified federal approach, perhaps an amendment to Title 38 that specifically allows the VA to fund and administer an equivalent ceremonial honor detail for these legislatively recognized allied personnel, thereby bypassing the Title 10 constraints entirely for this specific group.
And conversely, my stance is that while fully acknowledging the profound and heroic service of the SGU veterans, the policy distinction currently in place is vital. It maintains the strict legal integrity of U.S. Armed Forces service definitions under Title X. Targeted acts like PL 115-141 grant maximum recognition possible under the VA's Title 38 framework, while robust state solutions like the 2025 Minnesota law provide the necessary and appropriate mechanism for further localized recognition without collapsing essential federal legal categories. The structure is complex, yes, but the integrity it protects is, I believe, essential.
Ultimately, this discussion really illuminates the delicate, maybe even precarious balance between honoring a tremendous moral debt incurred during conflict and adhering strictly to established legal definitions of service and entitlement.
Indeed. The experience of the SGU veterans clearly demonstrates the complex interplay between legal statutes, moral recognition, and symbolic meaning. It shows there is clearly much more policy development and maybe difficult conversations needed to fully resolve these questions for allied forces who have served alongside America's military in past and future conflicts.